Just by way of a quick introduction, my name is Logan McCoy, and I'm the Vice President of Services here at CCB Technology. But who I have with on me as well, I have Jacob Tarowski, who is our Director of Enterprise Architecture. So let's actually jump into what you guys are here to hear about today, right? And there's really three main approaches when you're looking to move to Microsoft 365. And if you're on this call, this is probably relevant to you because you're looking, right? You've probably delayed, and I'm sure for justified reasons, of moving to 365. But it's kind of becoming more of that thing of, I think it's time, right? We should probably more seriously look at this. And one of the biggest challenges for our clients as they start to kind of go down that path is, what's the right path to go down? Right? There's so many different ways to get there. What's the right one for us? What's the one that's going to be the most cost effective, that's going to have potentially the least hurdles, that's going to keep us the most secure as we're migrating? What's going to really work from that perspective, right? And for us, because we've done this for so long and we've done so many different migrations, we've seen different kinds out there. And so there's three that I'm really going to highlight today that we typically see are done for clients in migrating them from their current email platform into the 365 stack. But there are nuances to these. There are differences even within the three that I'm talking about. And so when I say these three, don't think that, okay, so these are the only three. There's no other options. There's no other differences or changes to those. That's not necessarily the case. There are, but these are the three that we consistently see. And these are the three that we've seen over the number of years that we've done this work really well for different client scenarios and situations, right? And so the first one that you're going to see or hear about is what we call a cutover migration. Now, a cutover migration in that respect is essentially where we're setting a specific date and time that we're going to move your MX and DNS records. We're going to cut over where those are pointing. I know it's a little bit of a technical term, but essentially, if your email and your mail flow is pointing to Exchange or pointing to Google or whatever it might be, right? We're going to change where it's pointing to, and we're going to move it now to Office 365. And so the reason why we call it a cutover is because essentially within a matter of hours, we're changing where that mail is flowing, where that data is residing, all of that kind of stuff. Now, when I say a cutover, I don't want you to think that that means that, wait, so this project is literally happening all within just a matter of hours. No, the cutover process is happening within a matter of hours. The project itself takes a number of weeks, right? Because a lot of what happens ahead of time to prep for that is we're actually migrating all of your data, so right, your email data from whatever platform you're using currently for email into Microsoft 365. But again, what separates a cutover from what you'll hear about within the next two that we typically see and that we typically do for clients from a migration path is that there is a distinct and definitive moment where we are cutting over your entire organization from what you're currently using into now all of that is pointing to and flowing into Microsoft 365, right? So that's essentially at a high level what a cutover migration is. Now, the next one that we've often seen and done for clients is a hybrid migration. Now, this is it's definitely has some similarities to a cutover, but in many ways it's very, very, very different. And the reason why I say it's very different is because within a cutover, if you can remember at a high level what I was mentioning there, you're kind of taking this distinct moment where everything's pointing to your current email server and it's moving over, right? Within a hybrid, that doesn't have to happen. So what can happen actually in a hybrid migration is that instead of all of that having to happen all at once for all of your users, you're essentially able to set up your mail flow where it's pointing both at your hybrid migration, which is most likely going to be your Exchange on-prem and then the hybrid server that you currently have, but is also able to point to Office 365. So it's kind of like you're living in two houses. And the benefit of that from a hybrid migration standpoint then is that we can, one, do a test of, let's say we do a test of 5 pilot users to move those over to determine what does that experience look like and how does that go. And once they're in 365, how does that work with the users that are still within the hybrid environment, right? So we're able to do a test of that, whereas within a cutover, you're not. But then the other key component of that is then from there, you're able to move over all of those users in essentially whatever fashion you want. And we typically see that organizations, when they're doing that, they're moving them over in, let's say, departmental batches. So they'll move them over in everybody in admin, everybody that's in sales, everybody that's in operations. They'll move them over in those departmental batches, which allows them to be able to troubleshoot in a much smaller and contained capacity than compared to, like, we have to migrate everybody over as we would in a cutover type scenario. But it does also typically mean that a hybrid migration, because it allows for that, and that's what organizations want to do within that, means that those types of migrations typically take longer. And as I go through a couple of these additional slides, I'll give you some more insight into what timeframes are for each of these, right? But that's essentially what a hybrid is. You're living in more or less two houses where you have your on-prem Exchange server still functioning, and you also have your 365 tenant, and you're able to essentially have mail flow happening between both of those, right? And then you're just moving over those users as you see fit is really at a high level essentially what a hybrid migration is. So there's some similarities to a cutover, but in many ways, again, it's very, very different. Now, the last actual type of migration path that we see for users is what we call a hybrid light migration. And the best way I can put this is that it's really a bit of a middle ground between a cutover migration and a hybrid migration. It kind of falls in the middle, and it's not a perfect explanation even in that regard, but it's the closest way I could think of trying to describe both of those, right? Because within a hybrid light migration, you're able to do within a hybrid to an extent that you're able to do within a hybrid light what you are in a hybrid. And what I mean by that is you are able to essentially exist in both environments just like you are under a hybrid. You're able to do a test pilot user migration to see how that flows, how those users now residing in 365 work. There are some limitations, which in later slides I'll get to kind of point out between a hybrid light and a hybrid, but it gives you that ability to not have to do the cutover in one fell swoop. Now, when I say that though, what I mean by that is you're able to test it out, but then typically what you are doing is cutting over the rest of your users, right? And so even though it's not where it's a true cutover where you can't do any testing, you're literally just cutting everybody over in one fell swoop and there's none of that. Within a hybrid light, you're able to do a test, but then you're not doing those small batches like you would within a hybrid. Within a hybrid light, you're actually then going from there and you're saying, we've done the test, we've confirmed and verified it functions properly. Let's go over and then move essentially over the rest of the organization. So again, that's where I can say it really kind of falls in the middle between both a cutover and then a hybrid type migration. Now, for you, as I'm going through these, and I know I'm kind of going relatively fast, you're probably like, so what is the right path, right? So I kind of now understand what these are at a really high level, but what's the right one for me? And what are the pros and cons of each of these? What's going to help me kind of determine what's going to make the most sense for my organization, right? Because it's definitely not a one size fits all type scenario within any of these, right? There are nuances to them, and it's good to be aware of what those are so that you can make just an informed decision on what to do in that regard. So diving a little bit more into these, right? And that's what we're going to do over the next 3 slides is talk about what are the pros and cons of a cutover migration, of a hybrid migration, and of a hybrid light migration. So the first pro of a cutover migration is the time frame. Cutovers are typically the ones that I would say take the least amount of time. And you can see up there, it is normally in the range of about 4 to 6 weeks. And this is where I'd say it's definitely a pro for a client when they're coming in and saying to us, hey, we have this external factor that's now causing us to have to move on to 365 and we're having to move really quickly. If we hear that type of dynamic, we're normally just immediately going to try and say a cutover is going to be the right fit for you. Now, not always, but we're definitely going to lean towards that way because a cutover does allow for you to do this migration path in a much faster time frame than within a hybrid or a hybrid light. So I'm saying, yeah, it is true. You're typically going to see a cutover take between 4 to 6 weeks, and that oftentimes is a pro because of any of the three, it's the one that typically is completed from start to finish the fastest. Another major pro is that there's not really a ton of infrastructure requirements that you're going to have. And within that, I'll jump into the third one as I'll kind of go between both of these. It also means there's not going to be a ton of infrastructure configuration that needs to happen for this to function. Because within a hybrid and a hybrid light, you obviously need to do more within your environment to account for essentially living in two environments for a period of time, whether it's a long period of time or a short period of time. You have to account for that, right? And so there's a lot of additional configuration depending on what you're having to do that has to happen within a hybrid or a hybrid light that doesn't really exist at all in a cutover. There are a few things you have to do, maybe from a firewall perspective, maybe if we're having to set up a Connect or an SMTP relay server, that you have to do a few things here or there. But beyond that, there's really not a ton from an infrastructure perspective that's going to be required or that you're going to have to configure, at least not when you compare it to a hybrid or a hybrid light. And an example I can give in that regard is that within a cutover migration, if you're coming from, let's say, Exchange, we can look at your Exchange environment and let's say it's not the best, like it's just not been maintained, there's a couple issues with it. We don't necessarily within a cutover have to go through and remediate that in order to perform the cutover. Now, I say that with a big asterisk of we obviously would need to see your exact environment because it could be so far gone that we do actually need to do some remediation. But oftentimes, if we see some issues within an Exchange environment and we're doing a cutover, because those things don't have to be rectified for us to perform the migration, we can just move on without those, which is also why it typically takes less time to do these. Within a hybrid or a hybrid light, you are typically looking at, we need to remediate those in order for this to function properly, in order for you to be able to migrate seamlessly as you need to from your hybrid environment, your on-prem exchange, into the Microsoft 365 environment, right? And so it's a major benefit that you don't have those requirements, that configuration, or that remediation that needs to happen. And the last one where it's really a pro for a cutover type migration is you have the ability to migrate from a non-Microsoft email platform, and so essentially Exchange. And what I mean by that is Microsoft does have tool sets that you can use that is in-house that you can take and move from, whether it's G Suite, IMAP, something, or POP3 of any kind of shape or flavor, really. And you can then move that into the 365 stack. But within the tool sets that we use, and you'll kind of see as I go through this further what I mean by that, is that it really allows you to move those fairly seamlessly without having to be that you're coming from a Microsoft Exchange platform type of a dynamic. So being able to migrate from something like Google is another major benefit in being able to do a cutover migration with the tools and applications that we use in that regard. Now, some of the cons. The one that I kind of noted at a very high level that I'll mention again is that all users are migrated at one time. Now, if you're, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, for any of these pros or cons, and I'd say mainly the cons, in many cases, the context for us will actually kind of define if it's really a con at all. Meaning, like if we're talking that your user base is 5 users, it's really not a con to migrate all the users at once because it's such a small subset, right? But in the context of, oh no, we have 500 users, well, there's typically a concern then of, okay, so if something goes wrong, it could go wrong for all 500 users, and we're not able to test that really ahead of time, right? Essentially, yes, that's correct. Because in a cutover type migration, you are cutting over all the users and you're migrating them all at once. So you're not able to test that ahead of time to see how that flows, how users work, what that looks like. And so it is kind of a little unnerving at times for clients. Now, I say all of that because I do still want to mention that with the cutover migration, that's still probably the leading type of migration that we do for organizations. And it's one that we get incredible feedback on, meaning we're normally scoring a very high customer satisfaction rating, right? 95, 96, 98 out of 100% satisfaction of things that went on with that. So while I know it seems daunting and can be a bit unnerving, it is the type of migration I'd say that we typically see end users and clients doing the most, right? So just good to know and associate that as well. But a con that definitely comes with it is there is a cost associated with the third-party migration tool that we use. And the reason why we use this is because early on, we did utilize the internal Microsoft stack. But there are a number of limitations when you use the actual native Microsoft tool set. There's just limitations to what it's going to pull over. And then there's also limitations to what you're going to get from support so that if something does go wrong with the migration, being able to remediate that quickly. Microsoft was abysmal in their response time within all of that. And the other thing too is that it wasn't able to our standard, effectively automate the Outlook profile recreation that has to happen when you do a cutover type migration. So those 3 things for us made us say it makes sense to bring in a third-party migration tool to really do that, to give us the support that we need, to give us the full functionality that we need, and to really automate the Outlook profile creation in a satisfactory manner that we would deem is going to be a good user experience then when that's happening. But it is a cost, right? And it's typically a cost that when you start getting to a higher user count, you start getting to 500, 1,000, or even 150, 200, it sometimes can be cost prohibitive where we want to look at a hybrid light, for example. It does often require some end user interaction. That's another big thing to be aware of in all of this is that you oftentimes are going to be notifying your users because that third-party tool has to be installed on their machine. There's going to be some notifications that they see and all of that. So those are all dynamics that are part of that where there is going to be some end user interaction and notifications. Some clients don't want to have any of that. And so because of that, they say, well, let's look at more of a seamless integration with a hybrid or a hybrid light where the users really aren't going to be aware of this project even happening at all for the most part, right? The last big thing is that there could be a potential delay in mail routing. And not to get too technical, but to just keep it at a high level, when you do a cutover, you're not able to exist in both environments. You're literally moving it from pointing to your current email to then 365. And that happens in a point in time. And because of that, there could be a delay in that mail routing because of what you have your TTL or time to live set for your DNS and then MX records. And because of all of that, if let's say it's set for an hour, that does mean that there could be then a delay in that mail flowing. Now, typically in that case, most clients, they're not too concerned about it. You're not doing it at a time where you're going to notice that. And so it doesn't typically affect things, but it is something to just be aware of as a potential con in that regard, that there could be a potential delay in mail routing that happens at that time. Now, from a hybrid migration perspective, you are able to validate that cutover process with pilot users. And this is where I was mentioning the big difference between a cutover and a hybrid, though there's similarities amongst all of them, is that within this one, we really have the ability to test what that experience is going to be like, which gives you, as the end user, a really good understanding of what that's going to look like for your users. And if there's any issues, how to remediate those ahead of time so that they don't happen. Or if they do happen, how to know what to do really quickly to then get that remediated for them. And within a hybrid specifically, it really gives you the ability, as I mentioned, to cut over those users in multiple batches. You have the ability to say, let's move HO over R now. In a month, let's move over sales. In another month, let's move over operations, right? So it gives you that ability as well. There's no third-party migration tool required. So from a cost perspective, that definitely helps bring the costs down from a hybrid migration. So it definitely is a benefit in that regard. And then just like within a cutover, there was some of that end user interaction that we oftentimes for clients, if it's a con, it's because they don't want their users to be aware of it. Within a hybrid, it's a much more seamless experience for users. Now, from a con perspective, the biggest con that we see is really from a time frame side. Hybrids are the types of migrations that take the longest. You're talking 8 to 12 weeks is typically what you're going to see. So oftentimes double, if not more, than what you'd see in the cutover. It does require you utilizing the Microsoft email platform. So in order to be able to do a hybrid or a hybrid light, you need to be running Microsoft Exchange. And in many cases, you're needing to run Microsoft Exchange 2013 or later, I believe at that point. There's additional requirements. So while I said that there's no third-party migration tool, part of the reason why it actually still typically ends up costing more for a hybrid migration is because there is a lot that you have to do within your infrastructure to make sure that it's working and functioning properly. And one of the best examples I can give, just at a high level here, is that with FreeBusy. So if you're living in two houses, right, where you have some users that you've moved and they're in 365 and some are still on-prem, you want them to still be able to see each other's calendars and see they're FreeBusy. When are they free? When are they busy? You need to make sure that that is set up and functioning properly, because if your migration path is we're going to be doing this over 6 months and FreeBusy isn't working, well, that means for 6 months your users aren't going to be able to see each other's calendars if they're living within 365 or the others are living on-prem within your email environments, right? And there's a number of those that definitely can add up the overall time, which again is why it's the longest time frame. And then the last big thing of where we can see this as a con, and again, I say take this with a grain of salt, because if you have a really robust and experienced IT staff, this in many ways can actually be a pro. But for a lot of our organizations that come to us, they're like, look, I want you to do everything. I want you to set it up. I want you to migrate the data. I want you to do the cutover and perform any support and remediation. And so for a lot of them, they say, so within a hybrid, you're going to set all of that up. You're going to do the test migration for a couple test pilot users, but then we actually have to migrate the rest of the staff. And in a hybrid migration, the answer is yes. Because the whole point of a hybrid is that you're able to move those users over at your leisure. And the reality is most clients, when they opt for that and choose that, they're doing this over a period of 6 months to a year. So for us, it makes sense to say the project is done of what we're doing for you when we've set up that hybrid server, when we've tested with those pilot users, and then we move on from there, right? So that's one of the biggest downfalls if users are wanting us to take care of absolutely everything. Now, from a
One
hybrid
other,
light, oh,
one
go
other
for it,
thing,
Jacob.
Logan. One other thing too between a hybrid and a hybrid or hybrid light and a cutover migration also deals with how your infrastructure is set up. And within there as well, a cutover often facilitates cutting over from a lot of the older Exchange platforms. So not only third-party platforms, G Suite and other things like that, but also from your Exchange 2003, 2007 type environments where a hybrid can take a lot of work, or even a hybrid light, to get you to a point where you have the right infrastructure level to then support that type of migration. A cutover handles in a lot of times that ability where you don't need to do those changes in your infrastructure. So that con that Logan brought up there of those additional requirements from both a server and a resource perspective, but also then just the complexity of your environment. Sometimes it's not worth taking a 2003 environment and integrating it with 2010 or 2013 Exchange can be difficult. So the hybrid kind of gets ruled out there. So a few other things in there for that sort of thing as well, just to kind of pay attention to.
Cool. So within a hybrid light, you do have the ability to validate that cutover process with pilot users. So again, you have this ability to do a test to see how it functions, how it flows. You don't have that within a cutover. Definitely a pro within a hybrid light. Is the same with a hybrid. There's no third-party migration tool. That's a huge benefit and definitely a cost savings, which I would say this leads to, especially within a hybrid light, because you're not necessarily having all the requirements you have in a hybrid. So it takes down some of that configuration time. You're also not having that third-party migration tool. We're seeing that if you're 100, 150, 200 users, a hybrid light is oftentimes going to be the most cost-effective type migration for you, which is still giving you that seamless experience for those end users. It's a little bit less in the time frame from the hybrid side, so it's about 8 to 10 weeks for a hybrid light. So again, a little less than hybrid, but a little more than a cutover. And again, take that all with a grain of salt, because if you're like, look, I'm a year out, I can plan for this, then that really in many cases becomes a moot point. But it does take longer than a cutover. Within a hybrid light, just like a hybrid, it does require a Microsoft email platform. Now, we did see within some of recent tool sets that you can move from like Google. We have not done anything like that specifically within the Microsoft tool sets for a number of reasons that I alluded to earlier. There are some of those additional requirements. Now, for example, though, I did take out, like you'll see from like the last slide, under hybrid, it had free busy. Here, that's not a component, because again, within a hybrid light, you're not existing within that type of setup for months. You're maybe setting that up, doing the pilot users for a month, and then you're scheduling that cutover of all of the rest of your users in the following month, right? So you're not talking a long time frame like you would be within a hybrid migration from that
And the
standpoint.
and the real benefit
Oh,
here for that hybrid light option is to not have any additional software requirements to deploy to your end users to automate that email profile cutover or change, right? So you're pointing to your existing solution, and then it needs to point to Office 365. There's some automation tools that we use in a traditional cutover to handle that portion, so you're not touching every end user. And in this case, for a hybrid light, it automates that same process for you, but you're not deploying anything additional. So, especially where we are now with remote workforce and things like that, and you may not be able to take advantage of group policy and other things that you use to deploy software and push things out to your users. In this scenario, as long as they can talk to your Exchange server, which obviously they can if they're getting their mail, a hybrid light can automate that profile cutover for you, so that you're not having to go then manually configure something on each person's workstation.
yep. So hopefully that gives you a good, I'd say, in-depth overview of what I would say are pros and cons for both a cutover, a hybrid, and a hybrid light. But still, there's probably that question of, okay, but in a summary, which one's right for me? And I'd say it really comes down to 4 key areas, right? What's your current email environment size and complexity? Right? Are you running Exchange? Are you 5 users? Are you 150? Are you across, geo redundant locations where you've got some in the US, some in England? That in many cases is going to determine if a cutover or a hybrid light makes sense. What's your current email platform, right? That's going to be a huge indicator of if you can even do a hybrid or a hybrid light. What if any other applications are you using in the 365 stack? Because if you start rolling in Teams and SharePoint, and if you already have a tenant, we really want to look at it and say it might make sense to actually do, in this case, a hybrid or a cutover or a hybrid light. And then last but not least is definitely around that time frame component. If you come to us and say, I need to migrate within 3 weeks, we're really, sorry, my light turned out there. You're really only talking about a cutover from that scenario side of the house. And other things, just for whether you work on CCB with this migration or not, things to just be aware of that you also want to have in your mind as you're looking to migrate into the 365 stack is about 4 or 5 different types of areas that we see clients are doing when they're looking at all of this, right? The first is, are you wanting to do AD Connect or ADFS, right? And really at a high level, what that is entailing is around password synchronization. Do you want your Office 365 tenant and the users there to have the same password as they have when they're signing into the domain? SMTP relay, are you using any third-party applications or tools that you tie into email? So voicemail, faxing, printing and scanning, all of that, right? Might then mean you need an encrypted SMTP relay. Security protection, right? So do we need to make sure that you have inbound and outbound spam, or you need to have the encryption turned on, or things for data loss prevention, right? All of that are components that you want to just keep in the back of your mind. Training. This is a big one for end users a lot of times, where they say, look, it's new. We're often then going to be talking about Teams. We're often going to be talking about SharePoint. How do we work in this? What does this look like? And so factoring into your budget, some admin and end user training will definitely pay dividends down the road. And then last but not least, a big one that a lot of people don't think about is the office upgrade path, right? So a lot of people, when they're moving, they're coming from an old version, 2007, 2010. And a major thing is that Office or Microsoft 365 does not work with those older versions of Office. And so in order for you to be able to actually function within the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, you're also going to need to account for upgrading those users to a later version of Office, whether it's 2016, 2019, whatever it might be, right? But those are definitely considerations that you should.
Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like and share it if you found value. And make sure you subscribe to our YouTube page so you can stay up to date and current with all the videos we release.